Listen, thank you to the hundreds of you for joining us on this really beautiful September day, at least here on the East Coast, certainly here in Baltimore. I hope that's the case in New York, and hope that's the case wherever you are. As many of you know, our current issue of SAPIR is focused on faith. It's a really beautiful issue, and it's also an appropriate topic for this time of year, and especially in the weeks leading up to the high holidays and the Yamim Noraim, because this is a season of introspection where our tradition beckons us to take an inventory of the soul. In Hebrew, we call it cheshbon nefesh, right? Where we're inclined to stop, to pause, to assess, to reflect, and then to make a determination in response to that ever-present question, which is where can I grow and how? So yes, this issue of SAPIR is chock full of thought-provoking essays about questions related to one's relationship to a higher power, to a divine source. And as an aside, if those of you on the call want to print out copies of the faith issue and bring it with you to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, consider this an official sanction from your friends at SAPIR. And if your rabbi gives you a hard time, encourage her or him to sign up to sapirjournal.org. But I digress. So in addition to questions about one's personal beliefs, this issue also looks at other questions of faith. Faith in Jewish life, faith in our democratic institutions, and yes, faith in the future of American Jewry. Now, given the dramatic uptick in acts of anti-Semitism, how should we think about the status and station of American Jews today and for years to come? And what lessons can the history of Jews in this country, the Golden Medina, the Golden Country, what can that history teach us about how to think about our present moment? Who better to turn to divine the future than one of the country's preeminent historians on American Jewish life, Pamela Nadell. Pam is many things, a professor of history and the chair of the Jewish Studies program at American University, the winner of the National Jewish Book Award in 2019, the author of a forthcoming book that I presume will be entitled Antisemitism, an American Tradition. It'll be published next year, so everyone will be on the lookout for that book. Pam has testified 3 times before Congress, including in 2017 on anti-Semitism, that is, including in 2017 after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and more recently at the now infamous congressional hearings with the 3 presidents from Harvard, Penn, and MIT in the fall of 2023. And perhaps most importantly, Professor Nadell is the author of a wonderful essay in the current issue of SAPIR entitled "For America's Jews, Past is Prologue." So Professor, welcome to the program. We're really honored that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Just as a brief reminder to our audience, if you have any questions or along the way, and we encourage you to be invested in this conversation, if you have any questions along the way, please submit them in the chat box on the bottom right. We really want to hear your thoughts, your provocations, your concerns, your fears, your interests. Please insert those questions at any point throughout this discussion. And my goal will be to get to some of those questions in the final 15 or 20 minutes of our conversation. All right. So tonight, as everyone knows, is the presidential debate. But perhaps unbeknownst to some of our listeners, Professor Nadell was on a different and no less important debate stage 2 years ago with SAPIR's editor-in-chief, Bret Stephens, at the AJC Global Forum. And the question before you, Pam, was whether the golden age of American Jewry is over. Your argument was no, it's not over. Bret's argument was yes, it is. You provided your opening statement, and then it was Bret's turn. And I think, speaking for many of us, he leaned into the microphone and said, well, I hope I lose this debate, right? And I can't imagine that any prophet of doom wants to be proven right. Yeah, things are going to get a lot worse. And then we'll just live in that worst period of time. But these days, I think sadly, the question of whether we're past our prime doesn't seem to be up for debate, especially post October 7th. In your essay, though, you boldly write that you, quote, still have faith that America's Jews will continue to flourish. And I'm curious, what gives you that confidence?
It's so funny that you mentioned that debate with Brett from 2 years ago, because I was given the side. I was supposed to argue the optimistic side, which is how I came to write for SAPIR. But I went in saying, I could write the others, I could debate the other side, but I wasn't sure that he could, even though he's brilliant and could do whatever he's asked to do. But it is, as a historian, it is possible to understand that the moment that we're living in, and I make this argument in my essay, the moment that we're living in, we know so little about our history, or we've so idealized American Jewish history that we have read this moment as a rupture rather than as a continuity. And as a historian who's just finished writing a book about the history of American anti-Semitism, going all the way back to colonial times, I am aware that there have been moments in American history when anti-Semitism has been far worse than it is at the present moment. And so we've read this moment as, and it's a terrible, terrible outburst. Things had seemed to be really a golden age. Franklin Foer has written on the cover of The Atlantic. His story about the golden age of American Jews is over. But if you go back even to that period of the post-World War II golden age, there are lots of signs that anti-Semitism was still out there as a disruptor, and that American Jews were worried about it, even in those years, and understood that. So what we're experiencing is something we haven't thought we would experience in our lifetimes, but it rests on a long history in America.
I think that it's interesting because that history actually starts, that origin story of the Jews in this land begins with an act of protest against an act of prejudice, right? Peter Stuyvesant, 1654, first 23 Jews venture onto American soil, escape Recife, Brazil. And what happens there?
And what happens is they come to New Amsterdam. That Stuyvesant, within weeks of their arrival, he starts writing about these, and I'll quote, hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. And he also calls them usurers. He talks about them taking advantage of Christian merchants who can never possibly compete with them. But he doesn't control policy in the colony. So he has to send a letter to Amsterdam. And when the Jews who have landed in New Amsterdam, they do the same thing. They send a letter to the Jews in Amsterdam. And the ultimate result is that the Dutch West India Company that owns the colony, that needs settlers, that also had Jewish in it, says you can't get rid of them. You have to let them stay. So then he tries a few other tricks. But in the end, the Jews last longer than Stuyvesant lasts in New Amsterdam. And it's a lesson for us because it's a story about how Jews negotiate troubles in the time of anti-Semitism. Who do they appeal to? They appeal to Jews overseas. Who do they appeal to? They appeal to authorities to help them respond to anti-Semitism. And that's a lot of what I talk about in SAPIR.
I want to get to that momentarily. It was interesting because Peter Stuyvesant, right, then the governor of New Amsterdam, also was concerned that if we give to, I don't remember the particular quote, but some variation of, if we give liberty to the Jews, then we have to give to the Papists, right, and to other religious minorities and the Lutherans, right?
Yeah.
So in some odd respect, we, shaped by our own encounter with prejudice and persecution, were able to push back against the rules at the time that would have impacted other religious minorities as well in the process. So you paint a portrait of an American Jewish history that unfortunately is actually replete with acts of anti-Semitism. But there's something that feels a little bit different about today, if we're going to be honest, than what took place in the past. And I think that was in part because historically, there was this sense that we were, I guess it depends on the period of time, but we were on the ascent. We were not on the descent. That even during the worst of times, perhaps in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, there was a march against injustice. You won't allow us in your country club? Fine, we'll create our own. You won't allow us to climb rank in your law firm? Fine, we'll create an even more successful one. It energized an immigrant class to strive for more. But I don't know, at no point then did we think had been in a golden age. We knew this was a golden land, but we didn't consider ourselves to be within a golden age. And the thing I think that feels a little bit different about today is that we kind of feel as if we were in a golden age and we were fortunate to be in it, but the concern is perhaps that our peak is becoming our precipice.
Right. You're right. I mean, that is the sense of the community. But the question is, are there barriers being put up against Jews to succeed in America? And I don't think so. So for me, what I see as the big change in this moment is that in earlier eras, when anti-Semitism was, so for example, in the interwar period, the violent forms of anti-Semitism, the most virulent forms of anti-Semitism, were actually coming from the right. They were coming from groups affiliated with the rising neo-Nazi movement in the United States, or the Nazi movement who were trying to bring Nazism to the United States. What we have now, and we did not have this in the 1930s, except with very rare exceptions, what we have now is anti-Semitism hitting Jews both from the right and from the left. And that's what makes this moment, in my opinion, feeling so fraught and so different. And that Jews are navigating their path. But if you want to kind of compare, if you want to say we're at the end of the Golden Age, then to me, what characterized the Golden Age was the dismantling of so many of the official barriers to Jewish success in America. The quotas in the universities, for example, or the economic restrictions that force Jews, as you just said, to open their own law firms. We don't have that any longer. And it would take, in my opinion, it would take a lot to reinstate that. And I don't see that happening in the United States. That's why I'm optimistic.
So in other words, there aren't going to necessarily be any structural barriers or impediments that had once existed in American history. And so in the absence of that, we should be able to continue to flourish.
Right. The issue is when we're talking about structural barriers, it's not that there are structural barriers, but that there seem to be new social barriers that have emerged. So for example, one of the most recent anti-Semitic events that really hit me was somebody published a list of fiction writers. I read a ton of fiction, and they listed fiction writers and what they had posted on their, about the conflict in Israel and in Gaza, and it was published in essentially to create a boycott. And so that is the big concern. Will there be that kind of intellectual, communal, social boycott? And even most recently at the local Politics and Prose independent bookstore here, a Jewish author, well-known personality, TV personality, wrote a book, and her book event, which has nothing to do with the conflict, it was about January 6th, but her book event was disrupted by protest.
You're talking about the CNN anchor Dana Bash when she was at the bookstore Politics and Prose.
Right.
It's also unfortunately become an axiomatic truth, and perhaps not always the case, that whenever there's an uptick in violence in the Middle East, whenever Israel is at war or in this case with Hamas, right? But previously, when there's conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, there's often an ancillary uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. And I distinctly remember when I was in college about 20 plus years ago, I was in a conversation with a bunch of other Jewish collegiate leaders, so to speak. And we were talking to Natan Sharansky, and I remember him saying some variation of, he remember him calling the universities, or in campuses, call them islands of anti-Semitism, right? It's like a turn of phrase that just sticks in my mind. And so we saw elements of this to a certain extent in the early aughts around the Second Intifada.
Yeah.
It still feels a little bit different now, or
Oh,
considered
absolutely.
dramatically
It's
different.
different. It's more widespread. We have scholars like Eitan Hirsch and Robert Papp at the University of Chicago. Eitan is at Tufts, and they've been surveying college students. And what is clear, I was actually in a meeting with Robert Papp the other day. What's clear is that that those who are the students who express anti-Semitic attitudes, who express anti-Zionist attitudes, they're the most likely to blame American Jews for what is going on. And that's a change. That there's no question that this is the sense that American Jews are somehow responsible for Israeli politics.
Is there any fear, at least on your part, that, and especially on campus, that these, let's say, short-term social penalties of today could become long-term, I guess, structural impediments of tomorrow? Let me put it differently. If we saw elements of this 20 plus years ago with the Second Intifada, and we're seeing an over-caffeinated version of this today, 20 plus years later, what might that look like at that trajectory 10 or 15, 20 years from now?
Right. It depends on who gets into power, who gets into positions of power, because we're still talking about a minority, right? We're still, the Pew study shows favorable attitudes towards Jews. People in positions of political power display favorable attitudes towards Jews. What we're trying to do is stand up against a very dangerous, no question about it, but a minority's anti-Semitism and on both sides. And so, just as it's impossible to stop a lone shooter or, anticipate that lone shooter coming in, how difficult that is. We have the same problem with the demonstrations coming from the left on the college campuses. So it really depends on what happens in the future. But to say that American Jews are going to go back to the days when hotels were closed to them, when jobs were closed to them, when universities were closed to them, I just don't see that happening in the United States.
I'm with you on that as well. But I still wonder whether there are any warning signs in history that we should look for that indicate whether this is what's taking place is an aberration, or it's part of just an extended historical trend moving in the wrong direction.
Well, the first thing I should say is, as a historian, and I wrote this in the essay, I know a lot about the past, a modicum about the present. I know absolutely nothing about the future. Everybody always thinks historians like we can predict the future, but we're not. We're not seers. And the best evidence of that is that a colleague who wrote a wonderful book on anti-Semitism in America in 1994, as late as 2016, he was publishing things that said American Jews don't feel anti-Semitism. It doesn't disturb their daily lives. And of course, that seems, so ridiculous now. But it's a sign of how little we know about the future. But what we can say is that what are the conditions in which Jews, not just American Jews, what are the conditions in which Jews have flourished? That's probably the best way to examine it. So the political extremes, both communism and fascism, and I'm thinking of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, were horrific for Jews. Where have Jews flourished? They flourished in liberal democracies. And that seems to me to be the essence, is that how do we protect the rights of minorities? Liberal democracies do that.
Is there any part of you that's a little bit concerned about what appears to be an American society that is deeply ingrained in a sort of a polarized mentality? Going back to how we started with this debate later today, but a culture that isn't just so profoundly divided across so many different political issues that hit so close to a personal identity. What are the implications for that, for an American Jewish community, that wondering whether in fact we are past our prime or not.
Right. So I mean, for me, the last time the Americans were as polarized, I think, as they are at this particular moment in time, led to a civil war. And I hear, friends that I talk to in Israel say if it weren't for the war with Gaza, there'd probably be a civil war in Israel. I hear the same kind of thing, that we live in a moment of polarization. The post-war era was actually a moment when there was a lot, like a very strong center that held. It's partly why the conservative movement grew so much in those years, because it was really the most centrist movement. And polarization, because if we go one extreme or the other, is really bad for the Jews. I mean, that there's no question about that. But it's a question about the fate of the country writ large, don't you think?
I do. I also think there's another way of looking at our present moment, which is, and you sort of mentioned this in part in your essay itself, which is, let's everyone take a deep breath for a second and remind ourselves that the Second Gentleman of the United States is Jewish, that the Secretary of State is Jewish, that the Secretary of Treasury is Jewish, that the Secretary of Homeland Security is Jewish, that the Director of National Intelligence is Jewish, that the last two Chiefs of Staff to the President of the United States is Jewish, that the Senate Majority Leader is Jewish, that, a lot of Jews exist within the halls of power in various professional environments, including outside of government. And maybe we're still in this golden age, because a golden age is one. If we were to depart from the golden age, I can't imagine any of that would be the factual truth. That would be the case.
Right.
Your thoughts?
Well, the other thing is that it's what were the expressions of anti-Semitism in that golden age? Because if we read it one way, the barriers fell. It took a while, by the way, 70s. Some of them were still standing, even maybe into the 80s. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, no age is ever completely golden, right? So there were lots of examples of disruptions, Holocaust denial, surges in those years. And by the way, the Holocaust deniers, what do? They target the universities. There's this one guy out there who's running all these ads in college newspapers in the 1990s. Some of the newspapers accept them, some of them don't. Deborah Lipstadt wrote a very important chapter about this in her book, Denying the Holocaust. And nobody seems to really remember that, right? It's that people don't have the long view that historians have. So my view is that age was never completely golden. And just like the moment we're in is not completely a disaster.
Yeah. So was the golden age just like the 1980s and the 1990s? Like what was the actual period of
It's
time? What do you think it was?
so it's so interesting. So people argue about different dates. When I was working on my book, I've got somebody, a major Jewish communal figure, who says the golden age lasted from 1945 to 1965. I can tell you for sure it didn't start in 1945. And he was saying that the break comes with the decline of the alliance in the civil rights movement. Other people, Franklin Foer has a very different idea about the golden age and when it began to collapse, and he runs it all the way into the 21st century. It's so what are golden ages, right? Golden ages are inventions that people in their moment in time use because they're troubled about their own moment. So they look back and they decide there was a golden age. Nobody bothers to remember that Maimonides, who was supposed to be the epitome of the golden age of Jews in Spain, first of all, he fled his homeland. He ends up in Egypt, and he actually writes a letter saying that, he was never able to achieve all that he achieved, that he hoped to achieve, because he was on the seas because of persecution. So nobody seems to remember that golden age of Spain and the persecution that existed then. And that golden ages are figments of our imagination.
Yeah, I think I remember watching Yehuda Kurtis say some variation of like we are. I mean, let's not ignore the fact that we people who are alive today and are Jewish have the blessing of being around during the two most successful Jewish communities to have ever existed and are doing so simultaneously today, Israel and in the United States. And yes, there are profound challenges, and some might even say existential, in Israel. But Jews, what a blessing to be around at a time when there's more affluence, more power, more influence than at other times in in Jewish history. And one of the things that I fear actually is that as we continue to address the undeniable challenges of today, that we are going to create a scenario in which this is just going to become the expectation for our future. It's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're going to go down, that we're going to basically, we won't know how to channel our collective anxiety in the right direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of people are trying to channel that anxiety right now. So you and I were talking earlier. I've long been interested in the structure of the American Jewish community, the sort of the best disorganized community there is. And I was looking, and there are, according to the wonderful American Jewish Yearbook, which two extraordinary scholars keep going. There are at the 2023 edition has 1,269 national Jewish organizations in the US and Canada. And I looked back, I sorted the list looking back on by date. And in 1999, there were 570 Jewish organizations. So in the 21st century, the number of national Jewish organizations, I'm not talking about the local ones, national Jewish organizations has more than doubled. And so a lot of the energy and the anxiety you're talking about is getting channeled into creation of Jewish organizations and how to respond to this moment. And that gets back to some of the policy prescriptions of this issue of faith in SAPIR, because we don't want only to write about our thoughts, we want also to suggest plans for the future. And so that was something that I was trying to do in that article.
Excellent. I'm gonna get to that momentarily. A reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, we're gonna go to those questions about 2 or 3 minutes. Stick with us. I'm gonna ask 1 or 2 more, and then we've already received a number of really interesting questions, and Professor Nadell will be ready to receive them. Yes, you are right. I think there are also the number of Jewish organizations, national Jewish organizations, has grown exponentially at a period of time when our own the American Jewish population has grown a little bit more incrementally, shall we say, right? Yeah. But to your point, perhaps this is an indication of where do we channel these energies? We channel them in the direction of being creative. We channel them in the direction of connecting with other Jews and learning more about sort of our Jewish identity and learning more about our Jewish history. When I was served in the White House, I was astounded, most recently in the Biden administration, how many new Jewish organizations were created from the last time I was in that role at the end of the Obama administration in just a period of 5 or 6 years. So many new outlets devoted to different issue sets, and so many new outlets devoted to the same issue set, including, by the way, on anti-Semitism. The number of organizations has grown exponentially. But to you, this is an indication of what? These are indicators of what happening.
First of all, I think it's a powerful indication that the golden age is not over, right? I actually had made this argument with Brett in that debate. I looked out at the people in the room and I said, how can you say the golden age is over? Look at all these people who are here. Now, yes, they're worried. We were worried 2 years ago about anti-Semitism. The Biden administration was so worried about anti-Semitism that in December of 2022, it announced that it was going to create a national guide for combating anti-Semitism, and it issued that in May of 2023. So yes, American Jews are channeling their anxieties into a constructive way. Now, do we need so many national organizations? That's a whole different question. But
you have an answer to that, or are you gonna let that one slide?
I think that it's so tough. It's just so tough. We have some very powerful legacy organizations, and they're able to partner with other organizations outside the Jewish community, and that's really, really critical because this is not a Jewish issue. Anti-Semitism in the U.S. is a national issue. Anti-Semitism is a global issue, and Jews cannot respond to it just by themselves.
Okay, as you point out, one of the key features of SAPIR is that we don't really just like to admire the problem. We want to think through what are some potential solutions. And so you did hit upon a few of them. Can you share, just for an audience that hadn't necessarily read your essay, and if you haven't, please do, sapirjournal.org. What are how have we responded in the past to some of the historical concerns about anti-Semitism and our station in American life that we should utilize for the present moment and moving forward? What stands out?
Right. So the first thing that stands out is going back to the colonial period, how a very poor group of Jews appealed to a wealthy group of Jews, a well-off group of Jews for help. And that Jews, and this, of course, has happened with Israel right now, Jews are united around the world, and they don't fight their battles alone. And I can think of lots of examples where American Jews actually tried to help Jews overseas. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't. That's the first thing. Second thing, and this really goes back to the Middle Ages, and that is Jews seek alliances with governments in power. And that's absolutely critical. And your list of all the well-known Jews who are, serving in positions of the government currently, I mean, the second gentleman is probably the best example of someone who is using a position of power to stand up against anti-Semitism. That's really, really been striking. So that's another critical way in which Jews respond. And then finally, another way in which Jews respond is that they respond from the ground up. Sometimes sometimes they organize, as they do in these different organizations. Sometimes they stand up just as individuals. And I'll give you just one example, which is not in the essay, I think. But in 1877, when Joseph Seligman was banned from a hotel that he had frequented, Joseph Seligman came to America as a peddler. He was Ulysses S. Grant asked him to be Secretary of the Treasury. He declined that. So here's this prominent Jewish figure. And when he's banned from the hotel, the Jews in New York are outraged. And this one woman from one of those storied Sephardic families, she goes to the department store that the owner of that hotel also owns, and she closes out her account. She says, "I'll never shop here again." So even as individuals, there's a way to stand up and fight back against anti-Semitism.
Okay, I love that. We have a number of really thought-provoking questions. And we're going to start with Edward Lipson. Thank you, Edward, who asks the following. It seems that a difference between the Golden Age and the present is the existence of a Jewish state with an army. To what extent does Zionism, as emblematic of Jewish strength and agency, amplify contemporary anti-Semitism?
The first thing to say is that the state of Israel is established at the onset of the purported Golden Age, right? It comes into existence in 1948. Anti-Zionism, which really was exported by the Soviets to the West and to the Middle East, anti-Zionism is a key expression of anti-Semitism today. And I know everyone is always being asked, it's almost like a mantra, right? It's okay to criticize the policies of the state of Israel. It's not okay to object to the existence of the state of Israel. But anti-Zionists, I don't know that they always make that big distinction. And so it's one of the things I wrote about in the article is that essentially during the Golden Age, thanks in large part to Leon Uris's Exodus, there was a very favorable portrait of Israel in the United States. And now that has changed dramatically. And that is actually one of the critical factors that needs to be remediated.
You mentioned Leon Uris's novel Exodus, and we have a question from Anonymous who asked the following. In Nadell's essay, she points to Leon Uris's novel Exodus as an example of how, quote, Jews succeed when they can capture the sympathy and imagination of our Gentile neighbors, end quote. But Exodus was a smash hit in a much different America, one that was arguably more ready to be sympathetic to the Israeli national story as portrayed in Exodus because, one, the Holocaust was recent memory, and two, America was more religious and deeply familiar with the Bible. How has the challenge of capturing the Gentile imagination changed for Israelis and Jews?
Well, it has changed. There's no question it's changed dramatically. And in fact, that earlier list I was talking about of the fiction writers, that's become increasingly difficult for Israeli writers to even find translation in the United States. It's become difficult for Jewish writers to find publication sources. So you are right. We're in a very, very different moment. But I did hold out optimism in the essay because Israel remains an ally of the United States. It remains a democracy. It is a multicultural society. It has a lot of congruences with the United States. And I think part of the problem is that the students who have been, chanting all sorts of things about Intifada revolution, they've taken up slogans, but they don't really understand the what's sitting behind that. They don't really understand why Israel has long been an ally of the United States.
I want to actually, unsurprisingly, there are a bunch of questions related to Israel, so nothing new for you, I presume. But important, undeniably. Joe Levy asks, much of the current expression, to your point, Pam, much of the current expression of anti-Semitism today is related to Israel, most specifically the policies and actions of the current Israeli government. The Jewish communities themselves, both in the US and in Israel, are strongly polarized. Will a ceasefire in Gaza lead to a reduction in anti-Semitism in the US? And as you answer that question, I'm mindful of, I think this quote often attributed to Niels Bohr, the former Nobel laureate in physics, who said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. I'm under no illusion that you know exactly how to answer what will happen with a ceasefire in Gaza, but it's a legitimate question. Once there's a shift in policy, are we going to see a reduction in anti-Semitism?
Right. So the first thing I want to say two things. The first thing is that we know that historically, and this is recent history, we know that every time conflict between Israel and the Palestinians has flared up, that anti-Semitism has risen in the United States. I remember an essay that Bret Stephens wrote where he thought May 2021 was going to be a dividing line and that American Jews were never going to feel safe again. So I don't remember. I'm pretty sure he wrote it in SAPIR. So that's the first thing. So if the conflict, the level of the conflict abates, then anti-Semitism expressed in the United States, if it follows the historic trajectory, should quiet down somewhat. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, right now, everybody has been so focused on anti-Semitism coming from the left that they haven't been paying attention to it coming from the right. And anti-Semites on the right have been really ennobled by what's been going on, the anti-Semitism that's coming from the left, and that they're bedfellows. That's probably the best way of thinking about it. And as I often say, I'm actually working on the rebuild of the Tree of Life synagogue that's going to have a museum on the history of American anti-Semitism in it. And I often say that when we talk about what happened at the Tree of Life, the horrors of the Tree of Life, it's the deadliest attack on American Jews so far.
Hopefully that's not prophetic, but
Me too.
I mean, the notion of 1027 and 107, sort of these two periods of time, feel like the beginning of that major rupture ultimately for an American Jewish community that hasn't seen violence in the United States to the extent that we did that year. And we hadn't seen the level of violence that we saw in Israel up until that point. And again, these are two of the most important experiments in Jewish history coming under attack, and it's a terrifying proposition. Let me see. There is another question that came in. The golden age was of learning, not political safety. No one was necessarily safe in medieval Muslim and Christian Spain, and many great Jewish scholars fled, some to Israel and some to other parts of Europe or the Ottoman Empire. So not necessarily a question, but perhaps a response to your reference to Maimonides, who lived in the 13th century, and that golden age, and his desire to or need to flee from his country to a place of refuge. What are your thoughts and reactions to that point?
I completely agree, but because the concept of the Golden Age is invented by much later eras, so it's actually Jews, I'm pretty sure in France, who create the idea of a Golden Age in Sephardic Spain, and it's that they were looking for a different model. And I think when people talk about the Golden Age, and the questioner is absolutely right, it was a Golden Age of intellectual creativity, but I think they think more broadly about that that there was no violence, there were no problems, that it wasn't only a golden age of intellectual creativity.
I'm going to move now from your position as a historian to your position as a professor. And and by that I mean someone who operates on a college campus, and I think was voted Professor of the Year one year.
I got a big award at AU a
Okay.
long time ago.
Okay. Still, it's in your history. So one of the many accolades. So the question from Randy Shirka is as follows: how to identify anti-Israel activist faculty who foment division and anti-Semitic activity on campus, such as occurred in the encampments? How do you enforce consequences when policies and laws are broken, enabling hate crimes to surge? Your thoughts?
Right. So first of all, I imagine most people here know that there have been, several dozen, several scores, Title VI lawsuits filed with the Department of Education about hate crimes on college campuses against Jews and also against Muslims. And so we have some kind of mechanisms. It's also very clear to me that virtually every university that I know, spent a good portion of the past summer looking at their policies dealing with student conduct on campus. So, for example, these student conduct codes had not been updated. I happen to know one in particular. It had never been updated to talk about doxing. When it was created, nobody knew what doxing was. So the colleges and universities are beginning to respond. The interesting response has just come from the University of Pennsylvania, which has created a separate office to deal with Title VI violations. Now the question is, can they be done? Title VI violations, for those of you on this meeting, are Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prevents discrimination in any federally funded program. But it's based not on religion, but in this case, on an interpretation of that about shared ancestry. And so the question is, do we need an organization to deal with that the way we have administrative bodies dealing with discrimination based on Title IX, which is about sex discrimination or sexual harassment. So that's really long.
No, there's a lot there. Listen, one or two more questions, and I think we're going to wrap. This question comes from Jordan Parr, going back to one of the questions that we're discussing in the context of the Golden Age in Muslim Spain. He said some variation of the following: is it not hubris to declare the past decades a golden age? I'm sure, for example, that Jews in Muslim Spain did not think that they lived in a golden age, and later historians invented that term. So shouldn't we reserve that term for later historians, perhaps several centuries from now?
I love the question. Certainly, there's such an interesting way of framing it to talk about hubris. I think what's really interesting is that I've got, people in the 1960s saying the golden age is over. Brett and I were having an argument about it 2 years ago, saying the golden age is over. So people have been calling this the golden age, the post-World War II period. They've been calling it that for quite a long period of time. And so I don't know if it's a question of hubris or it's a question of aspiration, right? That we saw this period as so dramatically different. And it was also, you have to remember, it was also an era of, I talked about the kind of centrist politics, but also an era of tremendous economic prosperity and growth in America. America dictates the fate of all of its people and all of its minorities. And this was a period when Jews as a minority flourished. So I don't know that it's hubris.
Okay, that's fair. I want to just sort of wrap up this call with the way you kind of wrapped up your essay and asked you for just parting words as a historian, as someone who exists in the academy and is around all of the kerfuffle that we've seen in the past year and perhaps moving into the future. You write some variation of this: anti-Semitism has been, is now, and always will be part of what it means to be a Jew in America. But history tells us that, grim as the story has sometimes been, it has always and more often been good and even glorious. Knowing my history gives me an abiding faith that it will continue to be so. I'm leaving this call with ideally a better understanding of my past and a more optimistic understanding of what we need to do in the future. I'm curious if there are any parting thoughts that you want to provide for the SAPIR audience and family today.
The first thing that I would say is the number of people who told me how wonderful it was to read something optimistic was really, really a delight. That, everybody is talking about doom and gloom. But I'm not a Pollyanna. I know that there are a lot of challenges ahead and there's a lot of work to be done. But I remain confident that if we do the work, that American Jewish community will continue to thrive. We don't face the existential threat that our brothers and sisters in Israel face.
Well, this is an issue on faith, and so let us say amen to that. Thank you very much, Professor
Amen.
Pamela and Nadell. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this call. Be on the lookout for a forthcoming interview in the next, I think, 2 weeks with Mr. Rabbi Pfeffer. And for those who haven't read Professor Nadell's essay, I encourage you to go sapirjournal.org and read her essay and many others. And with that, thank you very, very much, Pam. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.